Dear ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to have a seat and to come back here for our upcoming panel. I am now delighted to continue the debate we started this morning with the ministers. Without doubt, global power shifts are shaping today's world. Emerging middle powers like Africa, like Brazil, or like India, South Africa, or Brazil are increasingly influential on the global stage. The rise of China ultimately alters the existing power balance globally. This power balance is changing to what some call a bipolar world, and others would rather describe as an imbalanced multipolar world. But whatever viewpoint one shares, the world has visibly become more fractured. Power and resources are distributed differently and, most importantly, more diversely than in the decades of the Cold War and the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. To discuss these questions and changes, I am delighted to welcome 4 distinguished speakers. Please welcome Chen Dingding, Professor for International Relations at Jinan University in Guangzhou and founder of the Intellesia Institute, focusing on international affairs. Welcome. I'm delighted that Otilia Anna Manganidze is joining us as well. She is head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. Welcome, Otilia. Please also welcome Shamika Ravi, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Secretary of the Government of India. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, a warm welcome to Daniela Schwarzer, member of the Executive Board of Bertelsmann Stiftung. Professor Chen, if I may start with you. President Xi Jinping said at the Belt and Road Forum, "Changes of the world, of our times, and of historical significance are unfolding like never before." He also referred to these changes in his recorded exchange with Russian President Vladimir Putin this spring. What are these shifts in the world, and how does China react to them?
Well, thank you. That's a very important and big question. There are 3 possible interpretations of that. Number one, the world is changing economically, politically, and socially for the last 70 or so years, particularly since the end of World War II. As you mentioned earlier, there are emerging powers like India, like South Africa, like other countries in the last 40 years. So that's one obvious change for the international community. And the second is for the last several hundreds of years, because we began the modern world with the Industrial Revolution, which started in Europe, of course, and it's been more than 400 years today. But we are entering a new sort of, what do you call it, industrialization 4.0 or something else. We are entering a world of climate change or artificial intelligence. That's also a very big change for the whole world. And lastly, I think it's a change even more than several thousand years, because civilizations we are seeing today, the older civilizations and possibly new civilizations are emerging. And altogether, I think our president means that these changes together will fundamentally shape the way we operate and collaborate, cooperate with each other. So in a nutshell, that's very broad, general, but more concrete policies will follow, with those principles.
And in your view, how should China react to these changes in its foreign policy, of course?
Well, China, in my view, I'm a scholar, so I tend to be more scholarly, when I analyze things. I think there are 3 principles for China to go through in the following years. Number 1 is to preserve and stability for the whole world and peace, and that's very important, particularly under the UN Charter. I think that's China's number 1 principle. And every sort of a conflict should be ideally resolved under the UN principles. So in the UN principles, UN Charter for the last 70 years also has preserved global peace for all of us. So that's very important, very effective. And then number 2, China wants to make positive contributions to global peace and stability, not only in terms of economic growth, technological development, but also in terms of regional peace and stability and all that. And that is why China earlier this year broke the sort of peace agreement between Saudi and Iran. And China today hopes to bring more positive energies to the Israel Palestinian crisis and also Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think all these are examples where China wants to make some positive contributions. And the lastly is China wants to, together with other emerging powers, to create or modify sort of a new global order, as the title suggested today, is contested international order. And I would say it's not just one order, it's actually orders. There are different interpretations of international order, and of course China's position is just one of them. It doesn't mean others have to agree with it, just to discuss, engage with each other.
Shamika Ravi, India is one of these emerging powers, and for this year, the IMF projects a growth of GDP of 6.3%, and that is, again, for the 2nd or 3rd year in a row, bigger than the Chinese growth, actually. However, for reaching Prime Minister Modi's objective of becoming a developed economy by 2047, India would need an annual growth rate of 7%. Do you think this is realistic, and what strategies are pursued and resources committed to make this happen?
First of all, thank you to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Great to be here. And at the outset, the contrasting situations across the world right now is quite striking. We just ended the G20 gathering, and I had the great opportunity to travel all around the country. In fact, a lot of our meetings were in Tier 2, 3, Tier 4 cities. It took you 2 days to reach them. And I wish I could transfer some of that hope and optimism that I saw in these small towns of India here. I wish I could bring some of that to Europe. Because the more I travel here, the more I worry because of just the situations around and in the region, etc. I am an economist. I tend to look at the domestic market. Please recall India is an economy of per capita income which is around $2,400 per year. So we are a country that has just come out of poverty. We are a low middle income country. But the Indian economy should also be understood as an economy where a population the size of Germany has similar affluence and income levels as Germany, coexisting with 2 sub-Saharan Africa. They have similar consumption patterns, they have similar concerns, and this continent of a country has to really navigate through this entire. There is a base effect, meaning the reason we have such sustained high growth, and the chances are it's going to be higher simply because we've had 3 continuous years after COVID of enormous capital expenditure from the government, which is going into core capacity building, what we call as economists, to the core economy. And what do I mean by that? You should think of the Indian economy today pretty much like the American economy in post-World War II. So this is in the 40s and the 50s when you have a major expansion of basic amenities across the country. So the bottom 20% of the Indian economy, if you consider the poorest 20%, access to energy, access to electricity, roads, mobile telephony, bank accounts, LPG, et cetera, have happened for the first time in generations, first time in their life. All of these are really moving towards a sustained long-term growth in human productivity. People are getting more productive on account of the fact that they have access to basic amenities for the first time. You're liberating women's time from gathering water, accessing toilets, sanitation. So there is almost like a micro revolution happening within every household across this massive, massive country. So there is that one strategy for long-term sustainable productivity enhancement of human capital through great investments of the kind. The second is, of course, it's a very challenging time around which there is anti-globalization movements across the world. And we, along with China, of course, we have been beneficiaries to globalization. So against these uncertain winds, there is greater talk of self-reliance even within India. Post-COVID, we became, it was staring us in the face when we had shortage of everything, because we depended so much, particularly on strategic sectors when it came to pharmacies, et cetera, pharmaceutical APIs. We began to develop strategies for certain core sectors, and this includes energy. Food, of course, we are beyond self-reliant, but energy and defense are two areas where there is a major push. Along with the fact that, again, the capital expenditure from the government is going into lots of sectors, including space. You probably just read, we landed on the moon. And that kind of optimism is spreading across sectors. So this is not limited to either the agriculture sector alone, which is seeing greater rural infrastructure surge happening, or the manufacturer. For the first time, actually, we're talking about Make in India in a very serious way. For the long time, for decades, we believe we have skipped the manufacturing step altogether because we might be making a transition from agriculture to services. No, not any longer. There is a clear push for manufacturing. Services remains our core strength, but of course, services is no longer IT. We are increasingly investing in healthcare. We do see healthcare as a strategic sector. It's one of our fastest growing sectors. It's not just a public health perspective to healthcare, but also an engine of growth. It's generating tremendous growth across. So you should view India really as a country which, over the next 25 years, you're going to see pretty holistic growth across sectors, across demographies. And we are hoping to achieve that through a lot of trade deals as well. And we can get to that in the next round of discussions. But all in all, good story.
Thank you. Daniela Schwarzer, you have delved into the question of how Europe can stand its ground between China and the US in several of your publications, also in one of your books. And many, including Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, call for a geopolitical union to do exactly that. Do you agree with that? And is Europe yet there, or what needs to be done to finally achieve it?
Thank you for that question. Great to be here. Well, I think, the past years under Ursula von der Leyen's leadership, the European Commission did embrace the concept that we are living in a world that is more characterized by geopolitical and geoeconomic conflicts than before. And Europe had to stand up to a Trump administration in the US, and increasingly thriving China, which clearly has an agenda, as we heard from Ding Ding, also of redesigning world order with its own ideas and concepts. So I think the reality is recognized in Brussels. However, the problem is, of course, for the EU that it has only few areas where it has full competence. The most important in the situation is, of course, trade policy. So that is an EU competence. It is a field where Europe has the biggest leverage. And very often when we speak about the question, is Europe an actor? Is the EU a power? The power resources that the EU really has is its economic power, the single market, and then its trade relationships with the outside world. And it's struggling to be a stronger player in the area of security and defense. However, we do see, and here I'd like to come to the extra challenges that Europe is facing now for almost 2 years, it has shown that as soon as Russia launched its full-scale invasion on Ukraine, the EU and its member states were very able to coordinate on their response in terms of arms deliveries, financial support, and also the sanction packages that have been agreed upon. If you compare that situation with the situation when Russia annexed Crimea, there's a real difference in the response, both in its robustness, because the attack was much bigger, and the goals that Putin is now more openly pursuing since February 2022 required that response. But it also showed that Europe was able to act. Of course, you can detect lots of areas where the EU cannot deliver because member states are responsible. And I think that's going to be the next big challenge for the next leadership in the European Union, to again look at a changing world around us and to basically follow two tracks, which I would say were the two dominant tracks under von der Leyen's leadership. One is to make sure that Europe protects what it has, to protect its strength, and we all know that in the area of economic development, technological advancement, we are in a real catch-up process. So the inner strength is one of the things we need to worry much more about. And then in terms of external action, Europe has proven capacity, in particular in the area of responding to crises. However, the longer term, the more strategic view, how Europe thinks of itself in the world, not as an actor, but as a power, I think that question yet remains to be answered.
Thank you. Actually, Daniel Schwarzer already linked our economic discussion to the geopolitical element. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the West really strived to make countries worldwide not only condemn Russia's action, but also to contain Russia's actions. But many countries accused the West of only being interested in its very own crises. And after the attack of Hamas against Israel and Israel's operation in Gaza, the West has been accused again of double standards. What, in your view, are the blind spots of the West, and what does the West doesn't want to see?
Right. What a difficult question. And I must say, with apologies for my voice, I left Pretoria at 40 degrees Celsius and arrived in Germany at -1, and my body was like, this is not normal. But I'm here and I'm talking. So first, perhaps a journey in between conflicts. We'll start with Russia and Ukraine. When, in days before Russia entered into Ukraine, a crime of aggression by way of invasion, I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. At the time, it was talk about the possibility of a war in Ukraine. And much of what was said then, and I say this because this was 6 to 8 days before the invasion, pressed on what would Germany do. The answer was unequivocal. Germany has not sent any military or other support to a third country in the way suggested, so we wouldn't do it. I remember sitting in the room going, has Germany never sent this kind of military artillery because the conflicts have been far? They have been in Mali, they've been in Mozambique, they've been in Niger, they've been elsewhere. But at the time, I felt like I was maybe one of very few people that voiced this opinion. Fast forward 12 days later, I hear a statement which was almost completely opposite to what I had heard in Munich. And this was suggesting that these are different times. These call for a different response. This call for a heavier response. Now, it is often said that consistency is the only real currency in international relations, but that presupposes that the issues that are confronted by nations remain the same. If your reaction to everything is the same, then it means you actually aren't consistent because you aren't applying a certain set of principles or values that guide your engagement. So, fast forward into the voting process around what is happening between and within Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion. The very first call I received was to ask me why African countries are abstaining. And I said, well, if I had a crystal ball and if I met with all of them, I would say this. I don't. However, could it be that they haven't had the time to think through what would be their position on a particular issue or not? And people are like, no, you have to be forthright. You have to have a position. Fast forward to barely a month ago, when I saw the voting pattern almost near opposite as far as the abstentions were concerned. Not as far as the countries that voted for or against, but the countries that chose to abstain. And in that instance, I thought to myself, if this had been the voting pattern in March of 2022, the analysis would be so much more different. And I was listening particularly to South African policymakers raising issues as to why they would vote for a particular resolution, using the very same language, using the language around territorial integrity, using the language around invasion, using the language around the right to self-defense. It is neither to say that either party is right or wrong, but really to confront perhaps conversations that haven't happened. Because the question I asked European policymakers with whom I engaged over the course of last year was, are you asking whether countries have abstained or voted in a particular way because you actually do not know? And they were like, what do you mean? Like, have you had consultations with any of these African countries about their position in respect of Ukraine, in respect of Russia, countries like Egypt, whose entire import of grain comes from those two countries? Did you have a bilateral engagement, a consultative process to understand what would it be for them? What is the bottom line? What is the line in the sand, so to speak? And they said, well, for some countries, and they mentioned South Africa specifically, for some countries, we assumed how they would vote. So if consistency is one of the only real currencies in international relations, assumptions can certainly not be it. We know that in order for you to get to a meeting of minds, you have to engage. Whether that engagement is in having some of what the foreign minister spoke to today, closed-door discussions about what are you saying, what is your current position, and what informs it first. And then you can still go out into the public and criticize them heavily. But if your point of departure is antagonism, then the reaction you will get, unfortunately, will be quite defensive. And then we will be questioning whether or not, at least on the part of Europe, not just Europe, but I think Germany, because we are in Berlin, whether or not the positions that they're holding are consistent to principles or they're consistent to proximity, geographic and political proximity.
Thank you. Mr. Chan Ding, you said in your earliest answer on the panel today that China strives to reshape the global order or to do international politics in another way. So if China globally evolves from a norm taker to a norm setter, what would these norms actually be, and how, would this different system that you mentioned actually look like?
Well, Europe has always been a norm power, right, for the last several decades. I think China, at least from my perspective, is learning from Europe when it comes to norms building process. And I remember I did my PhD in political science in the US in a total of 12 years, and my dissertation was about China's human rights policy in the post-1970 period. And so I did a lot of research about how, for example, the Europe-China human rights dialogue actually contributed to the thinking process of China's own understandings of human rights. So I think if you look at the whole world, I would not say they're totally different values. I would say they have overlapping values when it comes to specific examples. So they're not 100% the same, but they're not black and white, the kind of opposite. So I think that's the foundation, that's the basis where we can find dialogues, we can engage with each other. And I think China, in principle, is doing that by, I think, by now, if I'm not mistaken, China and Germany have resumed the human rights dialogue, if I'm correct, or soon will resume. And so this is the kind of norm, building or creator process I think we are witnessing today. It's not necessarily overthrowing everything, already in existence. Like you said very well, China, possibly India, and the US have been the biggest beneficiaries of globalization for the last 40 years, right? China certainly being one of them. So why would you overthrow that international order if you are already one of the biggest beneficiaries of the current order? So I think, it doesn't make sense for China to do that. So I think there's a sort of a worry that China would overthrow the international order. That, for me, is a little bit exaggerating. And I'm confident China only wants to be part of the international order, where at the same time trying to make some positive contributions. Of course, there will be differences, and there will be even quarrels and this and that. But I think as long as we try to, do not let our first impulse, as Foreign Minister Baerbock said very well this morning, right? Do not let your first impulse dictate your actions. Use reason and engage with others. Then eventually you're going to have some good solutions.
Shamika Ravi, India is a welcome dialogue and dialogue partner and host lately. Until November 30th, India has a G20 presidency, and this year India also holds the chairmanship of the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation, and India was invited to the G7 summit, so quite a lot. Itself, India positions it as the voice of the global south. What would that actually mean, and how does this relate to the world order as we have seen in the last years and decades, and to what Cheng Ding just describes?
Well, I think first and foremost, we must acknowledge the fact that the multilateral institutions through which we organize our relationships is severely broken. And in recognizing that these multilateral forums, these institutions are broken, they need major restructuring. And one of those major restructuring has to do with giving greater voice to countries like India and Brazil and Indonesia. These are major players, not by just virtue of being large democracies, but also on account of what a rules-based order ought to look like. And I think that is where the great dissonance in terms of the way Europe is seeing this war and the way the global south is seeing this war. And as you have repeatedly heard the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, articulated very, very clearly in saying that Europe does have a problem when it thinks that Europe's problems are the world's problem, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. And I think that core dissonance has to be addressed when we think of whether it's the UN, whether it's WTO, whether it's WHO. I mean, you can go on. The list is pretty long. And that's our view on this. However, each of this, for instance, the G20, I wish I could again just give you a glimpse of what the G20 felt like in India. It was a party time. It was a major celebration in the smallest of places because we, and now this is the economist in me speaking, we turned it into a fiscal stimulus for the hospitality sector. It became a mass movement. We had gatherings, international delegates, and extension. We had people and experts move out of Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, etc., and go to really tiny places. And it did raise, you know, the hospitality sector in a very major way. In fact, there has been a multi-fold increase in tourism, etc. So please understand that we see the world a bit differently, largely on account of the fact that we have to grow. For us, growth is non-negotiable, given our income levels, etc., etc. But there's another core angle to it, which I do want to put across to you. You know, the world has been, since 2006, that's the common understanding amongst scholars who follow political institutions and so on. The world has been in democratic sort of recession since 2006. Not if you look at it from the vantage point of India. India, women have, there has been a 16-fold increase in the number of women contesting elections in the last 25 years. Can you imagine that? 16-fold increase in the number of women contesting local elections. There has been a major surge in women voters. There has been now large number of, we of course have the 30% women parliamentarian seats given and so on. This is such a great time if you consider democracy throwing up solutions to some of these long-standing problems. I think, at least domestically, many things through democratic institutions appear to be working for us, working rather well. And we are very keen to not shake that board, not let anything come in the way of this growth path.
Ottilia, Chen Dingding and Shamika Ravi are painting a picture of a more multilateral and multi-aligned world as they envision it. However, we also, especially in economics or in business, have increasing polarization if we look, for example, at the policies of the US, and also where different countries are put in the shoes to decide for certain ways of cooperating. Like, from your viewpoint, how could South Africa or also other countries navigate this, and what is their approach if they ultimately, you know, have to decide?
Again, thank you to both Shamika and Chen, because in framing the conversation around the importance of the world to India, to China, likewise, the importance of the world to Africa, right? If, and I go back to my earlier remarks, if Africa's position on the global stage didn't matter, how African individual or collective countries vote on a particular issue also wouldn't matter. But when you have a continent of 54 countries, and if those 54 countries on a particular issue are not with you, questions arise as to whether or not this is an issue that is truly global, or it is only northern or western or eastern, depending on how you look at it. For the African continent, a continent that had to liberate itself from colonialism through support not only of African nations themselves, but also of partners in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas, there's a recognition that yes, you can exist in your own little neighborhood and you can be fairly okay, but you need to work together. You need to work in a system that allows for multilateral engagement. This is not only on economics mind, it's not only on questions of trade. At the moment, Africa trades less with itself than it does with the rest of the world. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area are not intended to undo that, but they're intended to stimulate greater internal trade for growth. At the moment, when it comes to conflicts on the African continent, if the African Union or the regional economic communities or specific member states don't champion that cause at a global stage, be it at the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly, those discussions are not had with Africa as a party to the discussions, but rather as a list on a menu, so to speak. So African countries, and I say this in two ways, I say African countries, which is individual, but then I also say African countries as a collective recognize the importance of engaging at a global level. We can talk about the multilateral global world order, the UN being in collapse, or whatever we want to, however we want to phrase it. What we cannot deny is when the UN General Assembly must sit to discuss a particular issue, the overwhelming majority of countries, including those who have missions to the UN that are very small, are in the room. They're having their positions heard and they're articulating them. If that system did not matter, they wouldn't be there. At the same time, we also see ways in which African countries are regrouping, if I can call it that way. 2023 saw two things. It saw the start of the expansion of BRICS, which will see new members starting on the 1st of January. But it also saw the new membership of the African Union to the G20. The African Union joins the EU as the only multi-country body at the G20. If you look at these things in isolation, you will think, oh no, BRICS is growing, it's becoming a monster. Oh, G20 is letting in new members that don't necessarily meet the old criteria. But if you look at them together, you see that for Africa and for African countries, being part of global debates, being part of global discourse that isn't just about Africa mind, but that is also about the rest of the world matters. I'll end with an example here. When the African Union and the European Union meet under the auspices of the joint strategic partnership between the EU and the AU, they talk about Africa. They talk about African issues. If they're talking about migration, they're talking about Africans migrating to Europe. They don't talk about how Europe could learn from Africa. They don't talk about Europe's challenges so much. It is a relationship that presupposes that Africa needs to engage with the EU for anything to proceed, but one that doesn't presuppose that the EU needs to engage with Africa in order for their position to be strengthened. So I go back to an earlier point. If the European Union, 27, maybe 28, maybe 29 in the coming years, member states, had a strong partner to its immediate south, comprising of 54 countries, there would be very few resolutions that wouldn't pass, because you have the majority of the world, so to speak, perhaps on one side. But to get countries on one side, you do have to engage with them level, as partners, not as beneficiaries.
Thank you. Daniela, Atilla just mentioned cooperation between Europe and Africa, but if we take a bit broader look at it, that we can consider relations among multi-aligned states as transactional, and I think that's what has been described by all three of them. And these transactional relations are characterized by overlapping interests, by cooperating from case to case. This also means, I think, to a certain extent, that the Western Europe has to be transactional too. But how does it actually fit the German approach of a value-based foreign policy, and also the German European strive to build alliances that go beyond this transactional approach?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ottilia for your analysis and your perspective, because if you look at it and listening to you, I think one might be struck that this only happened so recently, right? It really took Russia's war in Ukraine and the reactions to get things moving, while there was a lot of lip service paid to, for instance, integrating the African Union into the G20 before. I really think this momentum that was created where Europe had, in a way, a bad surprise, and so did the political West more broadly, that it could not take votes in the UN General Assembly and attitudes of partners around the world for granted, that the whole understanding of how to design the relationship had to change. And I think that is, after all, although it was rocky at some points, it's healthy. The term transactional, yes, I think that is true. It's not true for bilateral relations only for the past 18 or 24 months. This is very much in the nature of international relations, that you expect something, you have an interest, and you negotiate, and you get something back, and your counterpart also wants something. I think what has definitely changed is that Europe, and you mentioned Germany in particular, in geoeconomic terms, faces a new situation because it had to end, and it wanted to end, its overdependency on Russian fossil energy imports. And so the way Germany now looks at many of the partners around the world is very much with the question, is that a partner with whom we can build a reliable relationship in order to diversify risk and in order to build a relationship that lasts for the future? And that's not only in the field of energy, it refers to other raw materials. So I think that's where we are at the moment. Now, your question on a values-based foreign policy. First of all, I do not see a contradiction between interests and values, or let's say principles. And I guess this is true for European players, but it's also true for China, for India, for South Africa. Because you come to the world from a certain background. And for EU countries, it's in most cases, liberal democratic background where you have your own values and you want your foreign policy to correspond to that. I guess it's clear that the time of lecturing others is over. However, giving up those principles, because at the end of the day, you also have to come home and tell your voters what you achieved globally. And the foreign minister spoke today. She just came from her party convention, where she also delivered a speech on foreign policy, which very much corresponded with what we heard today. So you also have to bring the messages home, what you do abroad. And so I do not think that we are at a time where we are drawing lines between our model at home and the values and principles that is based on, and how we reach out to the world. And I do believe that part of the conversation we have to have about global order, and Ding Ding mentioned that in his first take, China has ideas, and they obviously come from the Chinese background, and they may be in conflict with other players, Europe, the US, and others. However, we have joint problems and issues to solve. Take climate change, take pandemic prevention, and other things. And I think we hopefully have an interest in stability, in protecting our own models, and yes, in part in our foreign policy to project some of the norms and values we have in what we do. Foreign policy is an investment. It costs a lot for all players. It's not only run by governments, there are also other actors who form part of the international relationships that a country has. Civil society plays a huge role. And all of this transport, and I think fairly enough, transports values and norms. The change that we see in German foreign policy is that if you take the recent visit to the Gulf region, in former times you would have probably in public heard more about certain ideas, for instance, women's rights, human rights, other issues. That has not disappeared, but it's less audible. However, I do believe that on other levels of foreign policy and confidential settings and actual implementation of projects, that will stay, and for legitimate reasons that I gave you.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about how to raise the voice of, like we for once call it, non-Western states on the global stage. We're talking a lot about China, South Africa, India, also Brazil was mentioned, the African continent in a whole. But how do we actually make sure that the interests of more countries than those now named on this panel are heard on the global stage? Because I think we tend to, you know, when talking about the so-called global south, we tend to talk about the power south, so about very specific groups of countries. But if we really want to create an international system that's more fair and more diverse, we also have to take a broader look at many more countries. Shamika, what would be your take on that?
I think the first step has already been shown in terms of inducting the African Union into the G20. For us, that was one of the highlights, frankly, of the G20 presidency for India. We definitely, you know, when it comes to the United Nations Security Council, for instance, it will have to be expanded. When we think of, again, almost all the multilateral institutions, the voting rights, you know, we will have to reorganize the management. We've been talking about a few of these more seriously, particularly vis-a-vis, let's say, the World Bank. Well, World Bank is perhaps the largest and most visible elephant in the room, but most development banks, international development banks, need to be reorganized to make sure that we do have proper deployment of funds and we do have a greater say from the global south. So I think it's not that we do not know what the problems are or what the intended solutions are. We've been talking about it now for well past half a decade. I think it's time for action now, and increasingly, whether it's, again, the war here or now in the Middle East, each of this takes us a few steps behind. And I think the biggest, I think, the challenge right now, particularly vis-a-vis climate change, I think that conversation truly, there's a fear that it's falling off the table. We are seeing meetings after meetings, the pledges seem to be increasing in size, and yet the difference between the pledge and the cash is appalling. And we don't seem to be getting any closer to bridging that gap, which means actual deployment for actual solutions on the ground and making a real transition, which we have to, given the science.
Thank you. Before we open up the panel for questions here in the room, but also from our participants online, one last question to Professor Tan. When talking about a multi-aligned and multilateral world, we also have to think about de-risking or making societies and especially economies more resilient. And that's something that, especially here in Europe, is now talked about a lot, as in particular, economic ties with and financial investments from and in China are vetted for their risk and partially reconsidered. And as far as I know, China criticizes these attempts for fracturing the global economy and ultimately limiting economic possibilities and opportunities worldwide. But isn't it the case that China does actually do the same by dividing its economy in a part that serves the global markets and one that serves more domestic markets?
Well, we have this slogan of double circulation economies. We have the domestic economy, which is the foundation for our growth, with 1.4 billion people, more than 300 million middle-class consumers, so on and so forth. But also we have the global economy. So I think they're not exactly the same thing when we talk about two circulations or the de-risking or before U.S. approach decoupling, which, by the way, has toned down recently. there's emerging talk in the US domestic circles about possible re-engagement with China, and that narrative also emerging in Europe, I heard somewhere. So the basic reality is we cannot be 100% just independent by ourselves, right? We have to rely on others in one area or another. It is impossible to be 100% independent, and it is unwise to be 100% independent in terms of materials, in terms of global supply chain, in terms of people's exchange like this one we're having today here. So I think China's approach is to continue to engage with the whole world, and hopefully in return, other actors would also continue to engage with China. Despite all these differences and quarrels, whatever you have, I think that's just normal. If you look at the human history for the past 7,000, 8,000, even more than that, that has always been there. But we have survived. So we have survived, Donald Trump, 2016, but who knows whether he will be back next year. But even if he comes back or someone likes him comes back, we will have survived that as well, because we have strengths, and Europe being one core part of that strength, globally speaking. So I think China's message is very clear. Looking at the numbers do not lie, right? And Germany, Europe has always been the top one or top two trading partner with China, and vice versa. I think that resilience will continue for a very, very long time. And I think that's the foundation for our continuous engagement. I think China would be very happy to be part of that.
Thank you. So to give you some time to think about your first question, I take a question from an online participant first. And the question is, how do the panelists perceive China's increased emphasis on conflict mediation? An example in the Ukraine peace plan, Saudi-Iranian normalization, or Israel-Gaza? And I assume that's a question to everybody else in Ding Ding Ding. So who would like to take that question?
So where to start? So let me start with Ukraine and Russia. What is called a peace plan, to me, never read as a real peace plan. So what I saw there is clearly an ambition to position China not only as a power thriving for global leadership, but also in concrete situations to get engaged and to obviously show that it wants to bring stability or peace to a certain region. But the paper, which is called a peace plan, to me, frankly, does not really qualify for a peace plan, although it was presented as such. And it's also, very hard for both sides, Ukraine and Russia, who need to look at the way China has positioned itself in the conflict. And from a Ukrainian perspective, clearly, China has intensified its relationship with Russia. So you need to ask both parties involved, would they accept China as a mediator in the conflict? And I think here there's clearly an asymmetry which would make that very difficult.
Shamiko, Tilia, anything to add?
10 years back, I had the good fortune to visit several European countries. And we share, we have civilizational connect, we have long border, we trade a great deal, we import a great deal from China. So we think a lot about China. But this was 10 years back, mind you, when I traveled in Europe, I was completely struck by the complete absence of China in conversations across Europe between, let's say, 10 years and even 7 years back. And I was struck. And now, again, I'm an economist, so I'm viewing things differently from perhaps the way most of you do, which is international relations and foreign policy. But I was just struck. And I would often tell that, it's surprising that you guys don't have a plan for China, because China has a plan for each one of you.
Share the community.
So I think there is a collective dissonance, and I think the chickens are here to roost, and we'll just have to get more pragmatic on a lot of these things. And yeah.
Maybe to wrap up the responses. I actually found the question quite interesting because it presupposes that China's role is new and that it applies in current contexts. In 2008, the organization I work for, the Institute for Security Studies, published a report on China in Africa, focusing on two elements, the sort of socioeconomic aspect and then also on peace and security. 2008. And I say that because while perhaps people walking in the streets of Berlin 10 years ago weren't as bothered about what China thinks on a particular issue, in a number of contexts on the African continent, China was involved in different ways, whether in trying to facilitate peace, trying to frustrate peace, or just there. So much so that 15 years ago, my organization wrote a monograph on this very theme. So it's perhaps a final full stop to the question you asked me earlier around Europe or Germany's blind spot. There are things that happen across the world, particularly in Africa, that whether China's involvement is one of them, or whether it's the way in which African countries are finding innovative ways to peace build in the absence of resources to do so, that happen while Europe is not paying attention. The game that then has to be played can be one of catch-up, whether it's through things like the Global Gateway, which was pitched in many ways not as a counterweight to the Belt and Road Initiative, but let's be frank. In reality, that is the intention. So asking today in 2023 about China's new role ignores China's old and continuing role in contexts that have not been Russia and Ukraine, that have been the Central African Republic, that have been Sudan, that have been the DRC. These are contexts in which China has been involved, not for a year, not for 2 years, in some for 2 decades.
Thank you. Chen Dingding, you wanted to react to that?
Yeah, if I might just add a few words. I think there's a reason why China wants to, if welcomed by all the other parties involved, to play this mediation role. I think it is because, like you mentioned very well earlier, for the last 40 years or so, China has been benefiting a lot from global peace and security. And China wants to preserve that situation, whether it's the Middle East or Europe or anywhere else, Pacific, Indo-Pacific. So I think that's the fundamental reason why China wants to play this role. But China's influence and the power is still very limited when it comes to European security, like you mentioned, where you never heard of that kind of talk. I, myself, as an international relations scholar, I rarely heard that kind of discussion in Europe or European security. I mean, first of all, China is really, really far away from Europe, right? I took a 15-hour flight to come to Berlin, for example. And so I think there's a reason China wants to be more peaceful, but China's power influence is limited. By the way, China's GDP per capita, think about it, is not yet at the global developed level. Close, very close, not yet. So that tells you for the next 3 decades, in my view, China's #1 and only priority will still be domestic politics and economic development.
Thank you. Okay, I can already see several hands raising. Maybe we collect and start with the gentleman here in front and then the lady next to it. And the gentleman over there. Maybe we'll collect 3 ones, and please introduce yourself and please be short and precise.
Yeah. Christoph Marschall from Tagesspiegel. I would like to ask a question about BRICS. Why should I take it serious? Just to frame it a little bit provocative. Clearly, they have a common interest against the dominance of the West, but is China, India competing for global roles and for roles in Asia? Are they in any way trying to coordinate their trade policies, their currency policies, their security policy, or is just a club which meets every few months and wants to have more members, but when you look, what is the substance? What is coming out of it? I can't see very much.
And the lady next to it, yes, please.
Yorita Tabako from Albania. First, let me say that I really enjoyed this very well gender-balanced panel. On Dr. Ravi's comment on, you spoke a lot about growth. Growth is not negotiable. Economic growth is not negotiable. For a long time, Europe has been based on the presumption that change through trade was possible. Now, foreign policy experts believe that that should not be the case anymore. As an economist, what's your beliefs on this? Thank you.
And also, yes, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm an elected member of the Taipei City Council. I just have a quick question, I guess, for the panel, which is, I'm sure I'm not the only one that senses a disparity between Professor Chen's first statement and his second in terms of China wanting to build a new world order and the fact that it has benefited immensely from the current one and seeks its preservation. So I'm curious, how would you reconcile that in light of, for example, increasing military adventurism in the East China Sea, the increasing militarization of the South China Sea, and continued quarrels with neighbors, including Southeast Asia, but also India as well? And how would the panel respond to that? Thank you.
Maybe we start with the last question, because that's still fresh in mind. Chen Linding, do you want to take it?
Sure. Well, China's military spending is still, in terms of percentage of GDP, far below US and other countries in the region. And Japan this year has increased its military expenditures toward what percentage I don't remember. But for me, that's not a big concern, because I think regional institutions are strong enough to deter any country from possible, radical actions in this region, and UN being one of them. So I think China's possible goal to contribute, not to overthrow. There's a difference between overthrowing and contributing to the building of international order. I think is obviously a long-term trend and will continue. And like I said, China's domestic focus will be its priority, even for the next 2 or 3 decades. Until then, China becomes a more developed nation and country. I think then we possibly will see some foreign policy changes. Until then, we're going to see more of the status quo from China.
Shamika Ravi, do you want to take the question on India and growth?
Yes, I think it's a level effect. When you are at $3,000 per capita per year, trade is very important. At 60,000, you can afford to say that, hey, trade, is a second-order issue. No, it's not for us. And I think historically, if you look at the evolution of a lot of these institutions, you have to, intrinsically, it's very closely tied with livability, quality of life, just per capita GDP in a nutshell. So yeah, for me, I think there is, it's a level effect. And why we think growth is, why we believe, I don't think we are determined. I mean, for us, it's a faith that with 3% absolute poverty, it's not a choice. Growth has to happen, and thankfully, the private sector as well as the state, they're working together with signing more trade deals than we have in the last several decades. And in fact, this was a question that we were talking about earlier when you said Germany. What can Germany do? Well, green transition. You have a big budget for that. We have the scale. that cannot fall off the table. For us, the green transition, the just transition is right there. It's very high priority, as you probably realized in the G20, the leaders' declaration as well. It's very important to put the right technology behind it, to get into these partnerships and the finance behind it. So trade, very important. I think the question on BRICS, BRICS is an old body now. And please appreciate that it has existed for some time, even before these wars. And those are important forum for India. Now, it doesn't have the sexiness right now, I think, of a G20 or a Quad sometimes, but it's a very important forum for us. And this is, again, a reality check. I don't know how many of you follow surveys. And I don't think people in Western countries appreciate this enough. Russia is very popular in India. It was popular in our grandparents' generation, in our generation, and we recently did a survey through the Observer Research Foundation, which is India's largest think tank, private think tank, and they found out that even the 20-year-olds and these young, relatively woke crowd, Russia remains very popular. So, you know, the world is far more complicated than the way you're looking at it and trying to fit them into boxes. And I think that just helps you understand that all these complexities need to be navigated because, I mean, they're there. They're a real fact. And we'll have to negotiate all of this when we design our national interest and we think of how to use these forums to further that national interest. Thank you.
On BRICS, your question was around whether or not it's just a space in which countries meet. If you had asked me this question a year ago, my answer would have been quite different. A year ago, there had been a number of countries that had applied for BRICS membership. There wasn't any set criterion around what membership would be. And then now, fast forward to 2023, it's the first time since South Africa was added to the BRIC that there is new membership. But it's not just that there's new membership. It's the UAE, for example, Saudi Arabia, Iran, not exactly your beacons of any democracy. It's Argentina also. It's less which countries they are, so to speak, and more that what a year, 2 years ago seemed like a ridiculous suggestion, even to some of the member states of BRICS, that there could be additional membership. And what would this new creature be called? Would it be BRICS? Would it be BRICS Plus? Would we just drop the acronym altogether and call it a coalition of whatever? And then in 2023, we see it as real. I was reminded this weekend by the former finance minister for South Africa around how BRICS started, moving essentially from finance ministers' meetings every so often to the kind of character it has now. I do think if you do not pay attention to not just the countries that are seeking membership of BRICS, but if you do not pay attention to the growth of a body that is outside of the existing other formal structures, that you can lose sight of some of the debates that are ongoing. What makes Qatar a potential broker of peace in any other region? What makes a country like Saudi Arabia be the space in which discussions with regards to Sudan can be had? If you don't pay attention to those developments, you almost can miss the forest for the trees. BRICS right now, I feel, is a body that is growing, so to speak. To end, I don't think they have clarity yet on what BRICS will be, not in 2024, but in 2025, 2030. What is clear is that the initiatives around the bank, the new development bank, are moving forward. What is clear is that BRICS, which previously did not issue statements in respect of conflicts, did so on the 21st of November in respect of the situation in Gaza and Israel, which was the first only political statement in respect of an ongoing conflict. One thing that I would want you to pay attention to is while the statement was wholly unproblematic, there were two things that were not referenced in that statement. The responsibility to protect was not mentioned, nor specific provisions related to international law. International politics, yes, not to international law. So I do foresee that we will have more statements from BRICS on political situations, on conflicts than we've had before, but pay attention not to what's in the statement, but what is kept out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, really, really short, because I think I want to take one last question. But
just one second. I think the fact that the BRICS has just expanded that quickly is a very good signal for the future. I think in 10 years, it will be even more important. Maybe for one simple reason, India's economy will be number 3 at least in 10 years' time. And then if you combine all the BRICS countries' economy together, I don't know how big it will be, but it will be huge.
Thank you. And then we'll take the lady in the second row. I'm really sorry for everybody else, but you have time in the lunch break to ask all of your questions.
Thanks. Heather Graby from Bruegel in Brussels. So very interesting comments on India's experience of the G20. Thank you for that. Thinking about that, and from each of your perspectives, what could the G20 be for? It's bigger, it's more inclusive than the G7, but it's tricky as well because, President Xi did not come to the summit in Delhi. There's questions about whether other countries like Iran should be invited. Some G20 members would like that. Is it an economic club for development? Is it becoming the anti-G7 political club? Or could it be something which is put to work specifically on issues like decarbonizing its members?
Shamika, please.
Yeah, I thought you were going to collect a few. I think, we have to go back to the original intent of the G20, right? It started after the financial crisis, so the intent was very much economic, but it has gone so much beyond. And I think this is the largest collection of the biggest economies, etc. But now it has expanded with African Union being a permanent member and so on. You should view the G20 as this very important forum, short of the UN, to talk about global matters and to come up and have a joint. I think the consensus part of the G20 is a major, major achievement that, yes, President Xi wasn't there, but the declaration was passed as a consensus of all these 20 members, well, 19 plus, but everyone really has very diverse view on things, and yet, in a fractured and increasingly tense time, to find that common ground is the real win, and that's the only way to lead forward together. And I think the larger global threats, in the form of, again, climate change, was at the heart of it. And therefore, we went so much into the green finance and, altering so on. But in no way should it really be viewed only as an economic or a financial motivation. It truly is a large development. And how do you get this larger global public good of climate, et cetera, on board? Otherwise, what else is there? Short of the UN. We can sit here and complain about the UN, but G20 is that very important platform to get there. And that's the way I look at it, at least.
Many thanks for this enlightening opening panel. I learned a lot about the multilateral and multi-aligned world that is evolving and about the expectations that different countries have for Europe, for Germany. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much to Daniela Schwarzer, Chen Dingding, Shamika Ravi, and Ottilia Anna Manganitsa.